Madison Gray was known to millions for her cheerful TikToks and snippets of her life as a single mother. To her 9-year-old daughter, Emma, she was the entire world, a constant source of love, guidance, and fun. On the evening of November 12, 2023, Madison posted a short video announcing her plan to meet with a buyer interested in purchasing a unique photo she'd taken on a recent trip to Big Bend National Park. Her caption read, "Heading to Walmart for a quick sale, one last adventure before Emma's bedtime." Madison's fiancé, Derek Turner, received a brief message from her around 8:30 p.m. saying she'd met the buyer and was heading home soon. Yet something about the message felt off. There were small, subtle details that only someone close would notice, phrasing she wouldn't typically use, a tone that felt cold. Derek tried calling, but his attempts went straight to voicemail. After hours without contact, he reported her missing to the Houston Police Department. They marked it as a possible missing person case, but warned him that adults sometimes left by choice. Derek, however, knew better. Madison would never abandon her daughter without a word. The following morning, the family received another shock. Her car had been found in a nearby wooded area, abandoned, with no sign of Madison. Inside were scattered receipts, her purse, and a set of keys. Local police, now alarmed, began combing through nearby security footage to piece together her last movements. Surveillance video from the Walmart parking lot showed Madison arriving, parking her car, and entering the store. About 15 minutes later, she was seen leaving alone, looking around as if expecting someone. Minutes later, 2 cars appeared near her parked vehicle. One, a silver sedan, drove off quickly, but the second, a dark blue SUV, lingered nearby, its lights briefly flashing before pulling up to Madison's car. This was the last footage of Madison alive. The next 7 days unraveled slowly for the family and law enforcement. Every hour felt like a lifetime. And with no updates, desperation settled in. As the hours stretched into days, the internet was alight with theories about Madison's disappearance. Some followers claimed they had seen suspicious figures in her recent videos, while others pointed to strangers lurking in her live-streamed walks around Houston. Online speculation only added pressure on law enforcement as Madison's case became a top priority, turning from a missing persons case to something far darker. Finally, on the morning of November 19th, Madison's body was found in a secluded spot barely a mile from where her car had been discovered. Wrapped in a tarp and left among scattered branches, her remains bore signs of a brutal struggle, leaving little doubt that her final hours had been terrifying. The investigation, already high stakes, had transformed into a hunt for her killer. With Madison's body now recovered, police launched a full homicide investigation. Initial forensic analysis confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, and additional injuries suggested an aggressive confrontation. Detectives set their sights on the footage obtained from Walmart, scrutinizing each second for clues to identify anyone who might have crossed paths with her that evening. Among the findings was the mysterious dark blue SUV, which had parked near her car just minutes after she left the store. The driver's face was obscured, hidden behind a tinted windshield, but the model of the car and a partial license plate number were enough to put authorities on high alert. They began running checks, correlating similar vehicles in the area and possible connections to Madison. While examining Madison's social media and personal messages, detectives noticed an unusual exchange on her phone the night of her disappearance. Her fiancé Derek had already reported a strange text message that seemed unlike her. It was short, stating only that she was fine and would be home soon. Yet Madison's phone was then switched off, and no further messages followed. Investigators flagged this as suspicious, suspecting the message might not have come from her at all. Meanwhile, the Houston Police Department received a tip from an anonymous caller who claimed to have information about a man named Marcus Rodriguez. Known to police for a history of minor criminal charges, Marcus's name had never come up in connection with Madison. Yet as police began their investigation, they discovered Marcus had a connection to the area near Walmart, as well as an unexplained gap in his activity that night. Adding to the intrigue, police discovered that Marcus drove a dark blue SUV similar to the one captured on the surveillance footage. Law enforcement, now with mounting evidence, obtained a warrant to search Marcus's home. There in his garage, they found his SUV. When questioned, Marcus claimed he had spent the evening alone, yet his alibi quickly unraveled. Forensic investigators found traces of mud on the vehicle's undercarriage, matching the terrain near where Madison's body was discovered. Inside, they uncovered more incriminating evidence: a small black hair tie, strikingly similar to the ones Madison often wore in her hair. By now, Madison's family had begun pressuring the police to bring someone to justice. Her online followers posted tirelessly, pushing for answers, while local news stations covered every development. The case was reaching a boiling point. Final on November 24th, Marcus Rodriguez was taken into custody and charged with the kidnapping, assault, and murder of Madison Gray. Yet, with his arrest, new questions emerged, casting doubt on the timeline of her disappearance and whether others might have been involved. As Marcus was brought into the station for questioning, the pieces of the case were far from fitting together. Motive remained unclear, and the police were left to determine whether he had acted alone or if Madison's tragic end was part of something larger, darker, and more sinister. The investigation was far from over, and detectives prepared to unravel the twisted web that led to the demise of Madison Gray. As the investigation continued, detectives looked into Marcus Rodriguez's background for potential motives. Known in Houston's police records for various petty crimes, mostly trespassing, theft, and disorderly conduct, he seemed like an unlikely suspect in a homicide. However, the dark SUV, the trace evidence found in his garage, and his proximity to the crime scene painted a different picture. Detectives dug deeper, combing through his recent online activities, financial transactions, and personal connections, hoping to find any link to Madison Gray. Social media investigators discovered that Marcus had been following Madison's accounts for several months. He had even commented on some of her posts, though he used a pseudonym that masked his identity. While his comments were innocuous, mostly encouragements and typical fan responses, it was a chilling realization for investigators and Madison's family. Derek Turner, Madison's fiancé, recalled seeing Marcus's username once or twice, but nothing about it had raised alarm at the time. Detectives wondered if Marcus had been carefully observing Madison's routine, waiting for a moment when she might be alone and vulnerable. Digging further, investigators found that Marcus had a troubling history with other women in the Houston area. 2 separate women had filed restraining orders against him in the past 5 years, citing harassment and stalking. However, these reports had been dismissed as isolated incidents, as no physical violence was documented. Now, with Madison's case, these records took on a more ominous tone. Detectives started to suspect that Marcus might have escalated from stalking to something far more sinister. Meanwhile, digital forensics teams examined Madison's phone records more closely. They discovered a series of encrypted messages sent to Madison from an unknown number in the days leading up to her disappearance. The messages were cryptic but appeared to reference her recent trip to Big Bend and her interest in photography. One message read, "Meet me alone, and I'll pay well." It seemed that Madison had responded with caution, agreeing only to a public meeting spot. Detectives now believed this message could have come from Marcus, who may have posed as a buyer to lure her to the Walmart parking lot. Yet one question lingered: why had Marcus chosen Madison? Why this specific woman, and why that night? As detectives prepared to bring Marcus in for a second round of questioning, they realized the case was more complex than a single predator acting on impulse. Madison's murder appeared to be premeditated, and the investigation was shifting focus from merely identifying the killer to understanding the disturbing depths of his intent. Reconstructing the night of November 12th became a top priority. Detectives pieced together a timeline of Madison's movements from her final moments on video footage to the discovery of her abandoned car. They needed to be sure there were no other people involved and every detail mattered. Security footage from Walmart revealed Madison parking around 8:15 p.m., entering the store, and browsing briefly before stepping back outside. Shortly after she returned to her vehicle, a dark figure approached her. The camera's angle obscured the person's face, but the grainy footage captured the moment Madison looked up, startled, before stepping back. She then disappeared from view, with the SUV's headlights cutting through the dark as it moved closer to her car. In interviews, Madison's family and friends recalled her as cautious, someone who would avoid risky interactions. For her to let down her guard enough to meet with a buyer, even in a public setting, suggested she had some sense of security. Perhaps she believed she was safe in the open parking lot. Detectives theorized that Marcus may have used a tactic of pretense or trust to disarm her, perhaps by acting as a fellow photography enthusiast or playing the role of a genuine buyer. This small opening may have been all he needed. Once he was within close range, Marcus likely overpowered Madison quickly, forcing her into his SUV and driving her out of the parking lot. Investigators believe she struggled, leaving traces of her belongings scattered in his vehicle, including the hair tie that had eventually been used to link him to her disappearance. Detectives traced Marcus's movements from that evening through witness reports, revealing that his vehicle had been spotted near the same wooded area where Madison's body was later found. A couple driving through the area reported seeing a lone SUV parked in an unusual spot off the road, though at the time, they thought little of it. Forensics teams analyzed the soil samples taken from Marcus's SUV, which closely matched the area where Madison's body was discovered. In addition, they recovered strands of her hair tangled in the SUV's backseat fabric. These small but damning pieces of evidence painted a grim picture of her final hours. With each discovery, it became clearer that Marcus had planned his actions meticulously, leaving as little trace as possible, yet the puzzle pieces were falling into place. Back at the Houston Police Department, lead investigator Detective Linda Walsh reviewed each finding with precision, committed to ensuring the case was airtight. Walsh had handled missing person cases before, but the brutality and premeditated nature of Madison's case left a mark. She was determined to give Madison's family the closure they needed, knowing that with each new discovery, justice felt closer. Now, armed with mounting evidence and a timeline, detectives began probing Marcus's alibi. When interrogated, Marcus attempted to cast doubt on his whereabouts, but the physical evidence was undeniable. Despite his resistance, the evidence trail was tightening around him like a vice. Detectives moved to secure a full indictment, while Marcus's lawyer scrambled to negotiate a possible plea. As the Houston Police Department closed in on Marcus Rodriguez, prosecutor Jill Strickland began building the formal case. Strickland was known for her tenacity in court, and with Madison's high-profile following, the stakes couldn't have been higher. She carefully reviewed the evidence gathered by Detective Linda Walsh and her team, including surveillance footage, soil samples, and the hair tie linking Marcus to the crime scene. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case against Marcus, but Strickland knew that, with his defense lawyer pushing to cast doubt, she needed an airtight argument. To solidify her case, Strickland brought in digital forensic experts to analyze the messages sent to Madison in the days before her death. The encrypted texts painted a disturbing picture of premeditated manipulation. As they decoded the remaining messages, a chilling timeline emerged. Marcus had carefully crafted his interactions with Madison, posing as a legitimate buyer interested in her photography, playing on her passion and her need to support her young daughter. Detectives suspected that Madison's decision to meet him alone was no coincidence. Further investigation revealed that Madison had expressed some hesitation in texts to her fiancé Derek Erner about the buyer's vague messages, but she brushed it off, eager to make the sale. Strickland found this critical in illustrating Marcus's calculated plan. He had known exactly how to lure her, and once he had her in the parking lot, he executed his plan without hesitation. In court, Marcus's defense, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, claiming there was no direct proof he had committed the murder. His lawyer pointed out that Marcus's fingerprints had not been found on Madison's body, and his DNA wasn't present at the crime scene. However, Strickland countered that the nature of the evidence, the hair tie, the soil, and his proximity to the site demonstrated a clear link to Marcus and pointed to guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Despite the defense's efforts to cast doubt, the prosecution's evidence was steadily stacking up. Strickland presented each piece in chronological order, emphasizing the thoroughness of the investigation and Madison's final interactions. Each detail was meticulously woven into a timeline that illustrated Marcus's obsession, his planning, and ultimately his crime. Still, even with the evidence in place, Strickland knew she had to prepare for every angle the defense might exploit. The trial date was set, and the media coverage intensified. News outlets and social media influencers followed the case closely, demanding justice for Madison and her young daughter. Strickland's prosecution team felt the weight of this pressure but were resolute in their goal of delivering a verdict that would give Madison's family a semblance of peace. In the meantime, Strickland continued her deep dive into Marcus's behavior and past, hoping to uncover additional evidence or patterns that could further solidify her case. Just as the case against Marcus seemed irrefutable, a startling twist emerged. The digital forensic team discovered that some of the encrypted messages sent to Madison's phone did not match Marcus's known contact numbers. A deeper analysis revealed the involvement of a second unknown number that had communicated with Madison in the hours leading up to her disappearance. This new evidence raised the possibility that Marcus might not have acted alone. Investigators raced to trace the second number, which led them to an alias Tommy Evans, a name not connected directly to Marcus, but with a shady reputation in Houston's underground circles. Tommy Evans, a known associate of Marcus's, had a history of fraudulent schemes and small-time criminal activity, often revolving around online marketplaces and scams. Detectives began to suspect that Tommy may have assisted Marcus in targeting Madison, perhaps with the promise of a profitable sale to lure her into their trap. Detective Walsh initiated a fresh investigation into Tommy, locating him in a rundown apartment complex on Houston's east side. Surveillance showed that Tommy and Marcus had met at least twice in the week before Madison's disappearance, suggesting they had coordinated efforts. With this revelation, the police prepared to bring Tommy in for questioning, hoping he might reveal more about his connection to Marcus and Madison. Tommy, under intense interrogation, at first denied any involvement, claiming he barely knew Marcus and had never met Madison. However, as detectives pressed, he faltered, unable to explain the encrypted messages or his recent encounters with Marcus. Further examination of Tommy's phone records revealed a series of conversations between him and Marcus shortly after Madison's body was found. The conversations were brief, and the content was vague, but detectives believe these exchanges were evidence of a joint effort to cover up the crime. Adding to the suspicion, a witness came forward describing a man matching Tommy's description seen loitering in the Walmart parking lot on the night Madison disappeared. The witness claimed Tommy had been lingering near the back entrance, glancing repeatedly at his phone. This sighting, though not concrete, lent further weight to the theory that Tommy had played a part in orchestrating Madison's murder alongside Marcus. With Tommy now in custody, the investigation expanded. Detectives began to see Madison's murder not as a random act of violence by a single predator, but as part of a more sinister plan involving both men. The revelation of a second suspect rocked Madison's family and followers, reknitting calls for justice. Forensic evidence tied Marcus to the physical crime, but detectives now faced the task of proving Tommy's role in the events leading up to her disappearance and death. As Jill Strickland adjusted her strategy for the upcoming trial, the narrative took on a darker complexity. Strickland knew she had to weave Tommy's involvement into her case, revealing not just a single-minded killer, but a plot involving two men who had exploited Madison's openness and trust. With the courtroom awaiting the full unveiling of the investigation, Strickland prepared for a dramatic trial that would expose every layer of the tragedy that had claimed Madison Gray's life. With the involvement of Tommy Evans now a significant lead, prosecutor Jill Strickland doubled down on connecting him directly to the events of Madison's disappearance. She enlisted Detective Linda Walsh's team to reconstruct communications between Tommy and Marcus in the weeks leading up to the night of the crime. The encrypted messages on Madison's phone painted a picture of calculated coordination, with Tommy likely serving as the intermediary who set up the ruse to lure Madison into that fateful meeting. Further analysis revealed that Tommy's bank records showed a sudden influx of cash around the time Madison was killed. Strickland argued that this was likely payment from Marcus for Tommy's role in the scheme. This financial transaction provided the prosecution with a tangible link, suggesting that the two men had been working together on a planned attack, but Strickland knew she'd need to demonstrate not only conspiracy but also that Tommy had an active hand in carrying out the kidnapping and murder. Without a direct witness, they'd rely on digital breadcrumbs to tell the story. Detectives continued to scrutinize Tommy's phone, uncovering even more disturbing evidence. Location data placed him near the same wooded area where Madison's body was found, hours before the police discovered her remains. This contradicted his initial claim of barely knowing Marcus and not being involved. It was clear to detectives that Tommy had likely played a direct role in disposing of the body, if not more. Despite the accumulating evidence, Tommy remained tight-lipped, clinging to his denial of any involvement. However, under pressure, he admitted to sending messages to Madison, though he claimed they were only part of a harmless business deal. He insisted that he left before anything turned violent, attempting to distance himself from the murder. But Tommy's explanations only raised further suspicions. For the prosecution, this admission established Tommy's involvement in setting up the trap, proving that he was more than just a bystander. In response, Tommy's defense lawyer mounted a strategy to argue that he had been manipulated by Marcus. The defense painted Tommy as an unwilling accomplice, an impressionable man who'd been coerced into a plan that escalated beyond his control. Strickland anticipated this tactic, knowing the defense would try to shift blame back onto Marcus entirely, casting Tommy as an unwitting pawn. She was ready to counter with the digital evidence, insisting that Tommy's communication, location, data, and financial gain made him an equally culpable participant. The trial of Marcus Regias and Tommy Evans opened to a packed courtroom. Family members, friends, journalists, and concerned locals filled every seat, anxiously waiting for justice in a case that had gripped Houston for weeks. Prosecutor Jill Strickland began with a compelling opening statement, painting a harrowing picture of Madison's final hours. She detailed how a mother, influencer, and beloved community member was cruelly betrayed by strangers posing as business associates. She argued that Marcus and Tommy were equally responsible, each man playing a critical role in the crime that ended Madison's life. The prosecution laid out a meticulous timeline of the events leading to Madison's death, presenting the surveillance footage, soil samples, and forensics that linked Marcus directly to the crime scene. The evidence showed a coordinated effort between the two men, an orchestrated trap that preyed upon Madison's trust. Strickland called expert witnesses who had analyzed the encrypted messages, explaining how they revealed a pattern of manipulation and deceit, with Tommy establishing communication and Marcus ultimately executing the violent act. As the prosecution introduced the financial records showing Tommy's payout, Strickland underscored the transactional nature of their actions. She argued that Tommy had not only assisted but actively participated in a deadly conspiracy, his role motivated by greed and a willingness to exploit Madison's vulnerability. The audience listened in shock as Strickland recounted the messages that had lured Madison to the Walmart parking lot, each message a calculated move in a game that would ultimately cost her life. Tommy's defense attorney argued back fiercely, working to create doubt in the minds of the jurors. He depicted Tommy as a simple man led astray by Marcus, a victim of manipulation and fear. He argued that Tommy had withdrawn from the plan when he realized it was more than a routine transaction, claiming Tommy had no knowledge that Madison's life was at risk. The defense framed Tommy as a minor player in a complex scheme, contending that he had been deceived into providing minimal assistance and then had tried to distance himself. Strickland countered these claims with the location data, which placed Tommy at the wooded area, even after Madison's body was left there. She argued that his presence at the crime scene, his financial gain, and his encrypted communications with Marcus all pointed to a man who was deeply involved in every stage of the crime. The prosecution asserted that Tommy's involvement was premeditated and active, making him an accomplice to both the kidnapping and the murder. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's case steadily wore down the defense's portrayal of Tommy as an unwitting accomplice. Jurors sat captivated by the chilling details of the crime, expressions of shock and horror flashing across their faces. Madison's fiancé, Derek Turner, watched from the back row, his face set in a grim expression as he relived those agonizing days of uncertainty, followed by the tragic news of Madison's murder. In his presence and with each piece of evidence, the reality of the crime weighed heavily on the courtroom. Witness testimonies, digital evidence, and forensic reports painted a near-complete picture of how the two men had orchestrated and carried out the crime. Yet, with each new revelation, jurors were left to question what could drive two people to such an elaborate and callous act. Strickland's strategy was clear. She wanted the jurors to see the human cost of the crime and to feel the full weight of Madison's loss. As closing arguments approached, both sides prepared to deliver their final appeals. For Strickland, it was the last chance to urge the jury to see beyond the defense's claims of innocence and see Tommy and Marcus for what they were: two men driven by greed and callous disregard for human life, each equally responsible for the brutal murder of Madison Gray. After weeks of emotional testimony and damning evidence, the courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back in. Their deliberation had stretched over 2 days, but now their expressions revealed a sense of resolution. Judge Marilyn Edwards called for order, and the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdicts. First, for Marcus Rodriguez, guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus sat unmoved, his face impassive, as the foreman read each charge. Behind him, Madison's family stifled sobs, relief and grief intermingling. Then, the foreman announced the verdict for Tommy Evans. The jury found Tommy guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and kidnapping. Strickland's strategy to portray Tommy as an equal participant in the crime had prevailed, with the jury seeing through the defense's attempts to paint him as a mere pawn. Tommy's face fell. And for the first time since the trial began, he looked genuinely afraid, realizing the full weight of his actions and their consequences.